thank you very much. And thank you for hanging in there to the end, just to hang with me. And this is a little different than what you may be used to or what you may have been expecting, because this is a talk that I have given before. I haven't given in a while, but it's certainly different for me. But I think maybe you'll appreciate it as we go through it. We'll see. We'll find out. So welcome to this afternoon session. As I like to call it, this stuff is cool, but how can I get my company to do it? Or as you might call it, businessing the S out of transformative development. My name is Mark Heckler. I'm a principal cloud advocate of Java and JVM languages with Microsoft. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, please do save those for the end, put them in the chat, whatever you'd like to do so we don't forget them. I'd like to get to them all. I'm just not sure how we'll do on time today. So if you can capture them in some way or save them to the end, by all means, please do so. If you think of them 10 minutes after disconnecting, after walking away, don't worry, that happens to me all the time. By all means, please reach out to me because I always like to say we have a short time here now, but we have nearly unlimited time afterward to go ahead and carry on the conversation. The purpose of this session and every session really is to kind of get the conversation started, because in 50 minutes or so, there's no real way to cover everything. So we just try to cover, and I'm just trying to cover in this, enough things to kind of get the conversation going, and then we can have a really great conversation that spans, who knows, weeks, months, years, who knows. But reach out to me, please, at markheckler@microsoft.com, or my personal email at mark@thehecklers.com, or better yet, on Twitter, because while I do check email from time to time, I'm always on Twitter. As those of you who are on Twitter know, if you're not on Twitter, if you're not following me, why? By all means, please do follow me. If you have any questions, comments, feedback that you don't want to share with the world, my direct messages are open. So just shoot me a DM and I'll see it, and we'll get the conversation going there afterward. So a bit about me. I am an architect and developer. I am an advocate, obviously. I've actually contributed content and code to several books. I've co-authored a couple of books. I've authored solo a book, and all those terrible things. I'm also a Java champion, Java 1 rockstar, groundbreaker ambassador, Kotlin developer expert, licensed instrument rated pilot. That's kind of fun for a different perspective, literally a different perspective on the world. And I'm an MBA. Now, that I bring that out because I don't often talk about that in my live coding sessions. But several years ago, I went back and got an MBA because I felt like it would help to give me a different perspective. And I thought it might be useful to understand kind of how the other half lives, if you will. Because we don't exist in a vacuum. And that's something that if you've been in IT, if you've been in comp sci more than a day or two, you realize pretty quickly that for a small budget, small amounts of spend, we have a certain amount of control over that at maybe the department level, team level. But anytime there's a large initiative, a large project, something that you really feel like can make a huge impact, we typically don't control those purse strings. Someone else does. And that's why I thought the MBA might be useful. I thought it might be good to expand my perspective, and it did. So I'm here to maybe share more of that than the first part of the things you're seeing on the screen today. So we'll see how that goes. Oh, let's see. Why did that not advance? Oh, yeah. So the goal for today's session is just the facts. I like to sprinkle my talks with movie references, TV show references. If you don't recognize this gentleman, wow, that's just sad. So check out any of the Marvel Cinematic Universe stuff, and you'll see him pop up from way back all the way to this year. So with that, moving on. So a few disclaimers, because I'm going to be covering some topics, and I try to take the emotion, the feeling out of all of it, and just crunch numbers. Try to, but I'm human. I make mistakes. I have opinions, and I do bring that to everything. Even though when you do a financial analysis, whether it's a very cursory or very intense and long running, you try to approach everything as dispassionately as possible. But of course, we have our conceptions, our preconceptions that we work in, that we try not to let in, but they're there. And we all make mistakes, right? So you'll see me talk about in this talk a lot of times documenting everything meticulously and having people challenge you on those things. There's a reason for that, right? But I do try to cover things well. I do try to rationalize and justify everything, not like you know, not in ways that are not merited, but certainly in ways that are merited. Measurements, and we will be making measurements. And again, I'm showing an example, and this isn't a one-off example because circumstances vary among situations. I mean, my situation now is not the same as my situation a year ago or a year from now, or if I'm dealing with two different client companies or partners, those two situations don't line up exactly. So anytime you make measurements of anything, you have to make assumptions. And with those assumptions, you need to clearly state and quantify them. And that's what I'll be doing today, to the extent possible within a 50-minute time frame, and a rather complex topic that I'll be distilling. So I won't obviously go into painstaking details, but I'll go into enough detail and state all of the assumptions clearly, measurements clearly, to where they hopefully will make sense to everyone. I always suggest, recommend, heavily encourage that anytime there are estimates and costs, and let's face it, if we're talking financials, there will always be benefits and costs, I should say. You estimate your benefits very conservatively. You don't want to oversell anything. You don't want to promise the moon, the sun, and the stars when you're going to see a 10% increase at best to your delivery velocity, or to your, your top line revenue, or whatever the case may be. So you estimate the benefits that will come of a given initiative very conservatively, and you estimate the cost very liberally. So if you think something will cost between $500,000 and $3 million, you don't estimate the $500,000 or euros or whatever the currency of choice is that that you're using wherever you may be when you're listening to this. You estimate those costs at the high end, because very few projects come in under budget. It happens, but it just doesn't happen as a rule of thumb. So you estimate the benefits low and the costs high, and that way it establishes your credibility, so you get the opportunity to do this again. It's always better to come in under budget and to have far better results than planned than the other way around. If it's the other way around and you've overpromised and underdelivered, you may not get a chance to assess anything and present anything again, and we don't want that to happen. The numbers you're going to see today are just examples. They're based on facts, and they're based on actual measurements and observations and studies and articles, but they are truly just examples that I've created for the scenario that I'm using in these certain circumstances. Again, your mileage varies, it will vary based on your circumstances. So please adjust sensibly to make them fit properly with your circumstances, and don't employ wishful thinking. With great power, and now that we have 3 Spider-Men to talk about, comes 3 times the responsibility, right? We have a lot more power and a lot more responsibility. Please use that wisely. And I'll get into a little bit more about this later, but the idea behind this is just to come to a better understanding of what you're proposing, what you're considering doing, and not to try to make it into something it is not. So most tech talks, you're probably wondering what is on the agenda. Well, most tech talks, most tech talks at tech conferences actually cover more of the right side of things. And we're going to be talking more about the left side of things. We're going to be talking about some financial formulas today, how they apply to things that we would consider doing within our team, our organization, our company. We're not going to be talking in this specifically about any technical implementations, although that does come into play as far as our case study, but we're not going to be diving in and coding it, right? By the way, if anybody doesn't know what this particular screen represents, this represents the sum total of all knowledge, right? Because it's everything they do teach and don't teach at Harvard, which is, I mean, let's face it, logically speaking, that's everything. So we won't be covering all that. We're just going to be covering a small wedge of that. So really what's on the agenda? We're going to be talking about a few financial formulas. Don't freak out. We're going to be talking about payback or payback period. We're going to also be discussing net present value and how that can be used to better assess perhaps the value of a targeted opportunity that you're presented with. We'll talk about quantification, how to take squishy measures or qualitative measures and turn them into something that actually has some hard quantity. Now, this is not easy. And this is why there's so much debate, and it's fraught with frustration and peril, and sometimes high emotions. We're not trying to anger anybody or excite anybody. What we're trying to do is just come up with some apples to apples comparison for various different initiatives that we could consider. We will base any quantification we make upon solid, well-reasoned, calculated assumptions, but they are assumptions, and that's why they need to be documented and considered and evaluated and shared and validated, because if we have bad assumptions, we're not going to turn out with very good outputs, right? Garbage in, garbage out. There are several steps to get there to the end result, but don't panic. Don't panic. Please don't panic. I always look at financial stuff, and sometimes folks say, "Why did you go back and get an MBA?" I mean, you were doing, well, what I consider really cool, in-depth technical development work, and why did you decide to go back and take courses in marketing and management? And well, I did that because I necessarily kind of had to, but I really did enjoy things like economics and finance, and I really firmly believe that if you enjoy the rigor and discipline of development work, you're probably going to enjoy the rigor and discipline of things like finance, because as you'll see by the end of this, you're applying formulas, you're carefully considering inputs and coming up with well-reasoned outputs. And that sounds very similar to development work. It's just a different domain. So there are a lot of complements between the two that I personally enjoyed, and I think you will hopefully as well. So let's start in with Payback. Payback is kind of the what I consider to be the starting point in terms of the financial formulas. It's arguably the easiest to understand. It's the easiest to justify in many cases. So we'll give that a good start now. Simply put, payback, you take the cost of the project and you divide that by the annual cash inflow or the savings. I mean, cost avoidance is a thing too. So if you avoid certain costs by taking on this project, that counts. So you divide the cost of the project by the cash inflow or the savings that you experience, and that results in your payback period. Very simple formula, very easy to understand, especially when you look at an example, which we'll do now. So let's say that you have a project that is going to cost you $500,000 or 500,000 euros. Again, currency doesn't matter. It's all just numbers. So if it costs you 500,000 and you can realize 200,000 a year of new income, that means in 2.5 years, you will have made back your costs. Pretty simple, right? And that's good. Simple is good because it gives us at least a very quick rule of thumb, a very quick measure that we can apply to something and say, does it make sense to even consider? Yes, no, great. Now, payback does, I guess just to give a little bit more explanation, payback does have some pros, cons, some caveats, some explanation behind that. Generally speaking, when you're talking about payback, the shorter the payback period, the better it is, generally speaking. And that's because you can get your money back faster to then apply it to another initiative. Makes sense, right? So if you have, well, let's go ahead on through the slide. I like to jump ahead and I need to try to make myself follow the points that I've established, right? So a longer payback means more uncertainty, greater risk. Interest rates could change, more opportunities could come up, the competitive landscape shifts, the market condition shifts. We've seen in the past 3 years a really great, well, several great examples on how much uncertainty there really is in the world. And we've seen interest rates change, we've seen employment conditions and budgets, and all of these things change. I do have to tell you that I gave this talk a few years ago, 3 or 4 times, and I toyed with the idea for a long time before I even gave it. And then I gave it. And like everything else, you've got so many things you can talk about that I kind of shifted onto other topics and didn't come back until recently. I was chatting with Richard about this, and he said, I think that talk is more relevant than ever. And if you look at the past 3 years, we've had a lot of uncertainty this current year with the economic uncertainty and the shifting interest, or rising, I should say, interest rates and economic uncertainty we're facing. Companies are getting a lot more selective in terms of their investments and initiatives that they make. They may have plenty of cash in the coffers, they may not, but even if they do, they're being certainly more judicious about spending it. You see venture capital firms who are being much more careful. You see companies that have been funded who are being much more careful about their spend. So all of these things mean that this is probably more relevant than it has been at any time in the last couple of 3 decades. So I hope, again, this is kind of the reason why I wanted to bring this up. And I think it makes a lot of sense. It also illustrates this point really well. The longer the payback, the more chance you have of your assumptions being wrong, right? So shorter payback is better. Typically, the financial types prefer a 3 years or less payback period. So 3 years or fewer, I guess, technically. So if it's a payback period of under 3 years, that's less time for things to go off the rails, assumptions to change, market conditions to change. It can still happen, but certainly a shorter window is more predictable than a longer window. Ask the weather folks. If it's a payback of less than 1 year, it's considered to be an essential project because while things can change within 1 year, not nearly as much can change in a year, plus the fact you've got that money back and you can apply it again to the next investment. So some drawbacks, because like any measure, there are going to be pros and cons. Here's the catch. Here are the catches, I should say. There's no consideration of total value. And what do I mean by that? Well, an illustration, I think, shows that very clearly. Let's say you're looking at a couple of different projects and one has a 3-year payback. So that means you'll recover all of your initial upfront investment. Let's assume for the purposes of this illustration, it's a full upfront investment. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're as you go. But let's say for this example, you drop the cash up front. That project, that initiative offers a 3-year payback. You'll get all of that back within 3 years. And it will give a little more value for the next couple of years, but that's it. After year 5, you're done. The lifetime value of that was $250,000. And you're comparing that with another opportunity you have in front of you that has a 5-year payback. So it takes longer to get your money back, but there's ongoing value. So the value is continuing, right? And up to a lifetime value of $1 million. So now you have these two choices. So you have a 3-year payback and you'll make $250,000 from it by the end of 5 years. You have a 5-year payback, you'll make $1 million off of that. But it takes 5 years to recover your initial investment. Let's assume it's the same investment for the two. Now, how does that work out? Which would you choose? Well, I mean, if you go strictly by payback, faster is better, right? 3 years is better than 5. We go with that. Life goes on. But let me throw in a couple more variables. Let's say for that 5-year payback, you get $500,000 in the first 3 years. So now you've got a 3 years, and again, let's say that the lifetime value is 250 for the first one. Let's say your investment is 200,000. Let's just go with that. So in 3 years, you get 200,000 back. You get another 50,000 each for the fourth and the fifth year to come up with your total of 250,000. For the 5-year payback one, let's say you make 500,000 in the first 3 years versus the 200,000 the other one threw off. And let's say over the next 10 years, you make the other 500,000. Now, which one do you choose? So payback might lead you to make decisions that you might not otherwise make, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So there are many factors to consider: a faster payback versus a better overall return versus more uncertainty versus the time it takes to make back the same money for reinvestment, et cetera. The time value of money is its worth in constant dollars. And that's by constant dollars. We'll get into that shortly to kind of explain what that is, but that's in today's dollars versus when it finally comes in. In summary, payback is a good measure, but it's an incomplete measure. So we typically use that as a quick rule of thumb to decide if something's worth even considering further. If it is, then we launch into our next round, right? There is another measure that's frequently employed, or at least frequently discussed, which is the internal rate of return, IRR. The big limitation with that is something that net present value does not have, which is that it uses a single discount rate to evaluate every investment throughout the entire course of its lifetime. Whereas net present value, you can break that out, as you can see from the formula. It's a summary of the net period cash flows divided by 1 plus the rate of return, raised to the power of that index of that time period. And that's variable too. So if you want to compare weekly returns or monthly or quarterly or semi-annual or annual or whatever, you determine that time frame that substitutes for the T in this formula. Again, an example I think is illustrative and helps quite a bit. So if we have a $1 million return, or $1 million that comes back in as far as income from a project, and it's spread over 5 time periods, you have a rate of return of 5%. That means that every year for 5 years, you will get a 5% rate of return. And so the total you would get is $1 million over the course of 5 years. But in today's dollars, discounted to today's dollars, that is $783,520, and the thing, the window's in the way here. I can't see that last bit, but it's $783,000 odd dollars, right? So it's discounted back to today's money. And that tells you in today's terms what you're dealing with. What that allows you to do is if you have 2 or 3 or 10 projects, and they each have different timeframes and different rates of return, you can discount them back to today's dollars and compare them apples to apples, which is a huge benefit. And it helps make decisions much more clear. So breaking that out, as I mentioned earlier, because net present value can change. So in a 3-year project, in this example, where the cash inflows or revenues increase over the life of the project, and that typically happens, you'll see this kind of a bell-shaped curve, or maybe it'll go up and level off and stay there. But in some cases, you see an immediate ramp-up benefit that then eventually tails off. So benefits, income, cost avoidances, whatever, can vary over the course of the time periods that you're choosing. And the costs of borrowing, or the opportunity costs, can vary as well. So we're looking at 3 different time periods. We'll say years, but again, that doesn't matter. It could be months or whatever. And your first time period, you will bring in an additional $100,000. The second one, you'll bring in an additional $200,000. Your third time period, your third year, let's say, $400,000 in new realized revenue. Your first year, maybe your cost of capital will be 5%. So maybe it costs you 5% to borrow that, for instance. Your second year, once you've established this, you've spun off this organization, or you've established this track record with this project, maybe your cost of borrowing decreases, and that's not unheard of. We'll use that for this example. Now you're only paying 4% for your cost of capital. Third year, you're paying 3% for your cost of capital. So we run the numbers. We come up with, instead of your end of year 1 value of 100,000 being 100,000, if you back it up to today, and again, for simplicity, what I'm doing is saying all revenues are realized at the end of the time period. Again, not necessarily the case. You can split those up. You can make it as granular as you want, but I'm doing this at a higher level, simplistic example, just to make it easy to fit on a slide and understand better. So at the end of year 1, we realize $100,000. In today's dollars, that's $95,238. End of year 2, we realize a couple $100,000. Back it up to today, that's worth $184,911. End of year 3, we realize $400,000 in new revenue. And that backed up to today, at this point in time, is worth $366,057 in today's dollars, for a grand total of instead of 700,000, as you might expect from over time, in today's dollars, it's 646,000. And again, I've got this in my way. Let me see if I can move this little window, and I don't seem to be able to. So let me change. Yeah, mouse pointer is just not cooperating. So we'll go with that, $646,000. So some inputs and associated challenge when it comes to this. We have to quantify qualitative measures. We have to incorporate positive and negative impacts, offsetting impacts, etc. Everything possible should be considered and factored into the equation. If you omit things, either intentionally or unintentionally, you throw your numbers off. And then it's just in the realm of wishful thinking versus an actual analysis, right? We don't want that. We want to be as rigorous as possible. You have to consider and state clearly how this change would affect your organizations or your groups or your team's work. If something affects this, let's say your team, let's scope it down. If it affects your team positively or negatively, you need to somehow quantify that. Will it increase your team's productivity? Will it decrease your team's productivity? Maybe it decreases it initially and then increases it over the next several months. You need to capture that somehow and quantify that somehow. Will it impact your tech stack? Will it, again, increase your velocity? Will it increase the complexity? You need to realize those things. Will it increase your costs associated with things as you take on more different hardware, or outsource this or contract for that? You need to realize how that, and document how that impacts your tech stack. You need to contribute to, or will it contribute to recruitment or retention? Probably not many of us chose a position, a career, a job, an opportunity based on the idea, the hope of working with old, outdated tech. And in many cases, what we look at as far as new initiatives are talked about extensively. Sometimes it's fashion, right? IT is susceptible to that, but sometimes it's because there is a reason for the acceptance of a particular technology or a particular approach or process. And if that is the case, that can contribute positively to your organization's recruitment efforts or retention efforts. If you're consistently working with an outdated version of a language, you're having to just find ways to patch and hold things together because everything is so old, what do you think that's going to do to your retention? If you can show a way forward, if you're working on an initiative that brings that up to date and maybe even leans into the future a bit, how will that help your retention? And those are very difficult to quantify, but they help with the business case you're trying to prepare. Again, how does it all affect the business? Because that's what the money folks are going to want to see. The reason I talk about this as a slight aside is because so many times as tech folks, we'll see something and whether we're logically analyzing it or intuiting it, we see that this could really help, whatever this is, whether it's a new tool, a new language, a new framework, a new library, just a new approach. And we see that something could really help our team or our organization deliver better. And we go back to our boss and we say, we need to do this. And our boss says, okay, why? Well, because we do. I mean, this will help us so much. Okay, how? Well, I think we could deliver twice as fast. Or, well, I think we could stop the hemorrhaging because we're losing people off our team or our teams. Okay, how can I present that to the folks who would sign off on this? And that's where so many times we look blankly at each other and we walk back to our desk and we just put on the headphones and we go back to work. Disappointed because we know that that'll probably not go anywhere. And it's not our boss's fault. It's not our fault. But these are things we need to look at, ways of capturing that can get other folks who control those initiatives to take notice. Again, not to sell a bad idea, but to get a better assessment of what it is and first to determine if we want to advance that. And secondly, if we do, to be able to fully and clearly explain why and why it makes sense to do it. So some pros and cons with putting numbers with it. That was a little tangent, but I do feel it's very important to recognize why we would go through this to begin with, because this is a little bit of a stretch for us, right? But it's such a good thing to do, and it helps our organization, helps our team, helps us. Okay. What are some pros with undergoing this level of effort? Well, first, a critical analysis yields a better understanding of the inputs and impacts. And again, it helps you understand why you want to even do it, or maybe you don't. It helps. I always look at the opportunity to disprove an idea I have as incredibly valuable, because if I say, well, I think we need to do this, and I do the research and I go, probably don't. Actually, we probably don't want to do that. I might mention that in conversation, but I'm not going to be pushing hard for it. And that saves me time and stress because I've looked at it and critically analyzed it to the point that I think, that's probably not the best idea for us. And then if the conversation does come up, at least there's more to consider, right? It can also provide more objective and compelling justification, because if you do really put the numbers to something and you say, wow, this is even better than I thought, but then you don't just go to your boss and say, I want to do this. You go in and say, this makes a lot of sense for us to do, and here's why. And there's power in that. There's a lot of power in that, because it helps you detach your feelings as much as possible. Again, we're all human, and really engage your brain, which is kind of what we do on a daily basis anyway. Some cons: when you put numbers to things, or when you try to put numbers to things, when you quantify qualitative measures, this can be very time consuming, as you might imagine. Literally, it can go on forever if you don't cut it off. If you don't time box your efforts to assess things and put numbers to them, I mean, this could spin out of control, and you could be doing this for, well, long past the time we're all on this spinning ball. So you want to give yourself some time to put together reasonable analyses, but realizing there has to be a cutoff at some point. This is complicated because there's no automatic conversion between qualitative and quantitative measures, which comes back to your assumptions, which comes back to documenting the way you're doing it. Because if you're just kind of rule of thumbing it and saying, well, that looks like that'd be worth a couple million, that's not going to stand up even to your own real critical assessment, certainly not anyone else's. So it does take time. It's not easy. So some caveats. Well, again, time is a constraint. You cannot analyze everything. And complicating that is the world keeps moving. So even if you look at something and it makes sense now and nobody else is doing it, none of your competitors are doing it, there's always a chance that they will. And that's, that's a bit of a constraint on your time as well. So gather enough data, and whatever enough may be in the circumstances, and then move forward. Assumptions form the basis of conclusions. Now, obviously, bad assumptions can yield inaccurate conclusions, but even good assumptions can result in inaccurate conclusions if they're not properly analyzed and weighted and what have you. So we want to capture good assumptions, but we also need to employ rigor from that point forward as well. How do you do that? Well, you document those assumptions meticulously, and then you share them. You be open to refinement and discussion. I like to, personally, I like to loop in the financial folks or a financial person as soon as possible. And this comes from personal experience, by the way. I've worked with financial units within multiple companies in a previous life. And I without fail, once I have a certain amount of assumptions documented and a certain amount of numbers kind of captured, again, everything is still forming, right? But the assumptions are largely solidified at that point. And I seek out somebody in finance to speak with and to just share and get some inputs from. And I'm always really careful how I say this because I don't want it to sound manipulative. It is not. But the good thing about doing that, when you put the numbers together and you sit down and communicate as peers with someone in the finance group, is that they can sanity check your assumptions. They can verify or validate your assumptions or tell you where they're off. And by the way, before you even go to them, typically you would speak with somebody else in your department or your boss or whomever, and just from the technical side, kind of get a sanity check on those assumptions as well. But when you speak with somebody in finance, and I've seen this happen to me personally on a couple of different occasions, when you work with somebody in finance and they look at your numbers, they look at your assumptions and they go, yeah, that kind of makes sense, but I think this is a little high. That's a reasonable assumption, but you're overestimating, I think, based on this, and this, how fast we can propagate this through our organization, or we don't have the budget for this particular segment of your proposal, so that you're probably gonna have to slow that down to half, or whatever the case may be. At that point, they're not sitting across the table from you. They're sitting beside you, working with you on your assumptions, on your conclusions, your quantitating, if you will, the quantification of your qualitative measures. And I've seen this happen before. The first time this happened to me, it was just incredible because at some point, somebody else is going to find out, typically in the financial side of the house, that you're getting ready to propose something kind of big. And what often happens is, I mean, they're human like us, right? They talk and somebody says, hey, did you hear about that project that Mark Heckler guy is proposing? That sounds huge. And I'm not sure, I don't know, is that even going to work? That sounds a little crazy. And my contact, who I've been working with along on this proposal, said, oh, no, I've been working with him on this and it makes perfect sense. The numbers are solid. We've tweaked a few things, but yeah, this looks pretty good. And you know what they just became? They became your advocate, which again, I don't say to share this to make them an advocate or to manipulate them in any way. It's sharing, it's realizing that they are on the same team as you and you are on the same team as them, because we should all be pulling in the same direction for the same team. So it's a huge side benefit, but it can't be discounted. So let's run through this. Doing okay on time. I just check it every so often because I want to make sure I don't run out at the end. And I think we're good. So the suit is optional. As you can see, I'm not wearing one, so choose your attire. So the example I'm going to be using is distributed architectures. Sometimes this is called microservices. That term has kind of fallen out of favor for good reason, because like everything in tech, you get a term that kind of everybody goes, oh, I kind of understand what it is. And then the marketing folks get it, and then it's all over. Microservices is actually a flawed term to begin with, because it implies size, and it's not related to size, but to functions. So whether you call them distributed systems, which are based on distributed architectures, or microservices or nanoservices, or whatever you want to call them, they're not the same thing, but we'll use those terms kind of interchangeably. And we don't necessarily determine the technology for deployment. We just want to say it's a distributed architecture for the purposes of this analysis. And why would we consider this, right? Why not another topic? I have people ask me that, again, I haven't given this talk for a while, but each time I give it, somebody says, why not a migration to the cloud, or this or that? Well, I work for a cloud company, and I don't want anybody to feel like I'm trying to make the case, go buy our stuff, even though there is a clear and compelling case for that. If you want that data, I can share it. But this is just a kind of a good discussion to talk about the concepts and the how-tos today. So I picked something that I don't think anybody will feel like I'm pushing for my purposes. So yeah, it works. So we'll go with that. And by the way, some folks are heavy into distributed systems. Some folks are not. Will monoliths exist past the time that once we're all gone? Sure, the monoliths will exist. Microservices or distributed architectures in some form or another will exist for years to come as well. And I like to kind of point to this that William Gibson once said, the future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed. So if you're working wholly with monoliths right now, it is what it is. If you're working 100% distributed architecture, that's great. Although frankly, even the folks who are the farthest along on that curve, there are going to be some monoliths still hidden in there somewhere. So we're all somewhere on that spectrum. It's all good. Some notes about distributed architectures, because I'm going to be proposing this as a project to move to a distributed architecture in this particular example. Again, not proposing this for anybody's specific circumstances in their organization, just saying this for the purposes of analysis today for this talk. Your mileage may vary. Is there a term, your kilometer age may vary? That's interesting. We'll talk about that offline as well. So in terms of how we're assessing this, well, we're considering that the return on investment is driven by an accelerated realization of benefits rather than an overall business transformation. And that's not entirely the case, because there are going to be some areas that we can perhaps capitalize on based on a business transformation. And we'll discuss those as we go as well. We're going to be considering that there will probably, likely, in many cases, be reduced maintenance costs by moving to a distributed architectures. There will be other costs added, but we're certainly going to be looking at reduced maintenance costs because of the ease of updating code that is much more bounded in its scope than a massive 3 million lines of code system, a single system. There may be increased business opportunities through new APIs, as I mentioned. And I hate to point out anybody in particular, but certainly companies like Amazon realized that early in their approach to breaking things into distributed systems, that there were APIs, even though they were created for internal use only, they could be exposed much more easily to partners and customers. So that certainly opens up opportunities. I try not to bring that into this assessment today. I kind of allude to it in certain cases. But you may find a lot of new opportunities, may even find that those opportunities dwarf your current opportunities, but we don't know that. And I'm not going to incorporate that, per se into the analysis today. It allows you to selectively scale only high demand services, which reduces your costs. Again, for the purposes of our consideration today, when you scale a monolith, you scale everything, including capabilities that are ill-used, rarely used, certainly not used at this point in time. Whereas when you break out and tease out those services that need to scale, that are much more volatile, then you can do that much more efficiently. And we'll be capturing that. There is a service level selection of technologies, which also reduces costs. So if you can make certain things, implement certain things using serverless, if you will, or functions, scale to zero if you use certain languages for certain constructs, because maybe you deal with external APIs, which are more tied to a particular like messaging platform, or you're working with a partner which uses a particular framework, or whatever the case may be. You can break out your selection of technologies at the service level versus for rewriting or retooling your entire monolith or putting some kind of stopgap into place to incorporate all of the above into one thing. There will be an investment required, upskilling, coaching, mentoring. Any new initiative has costs. And in this case, for this particular business case, for this particular example, if we're moving to distributed architecture, and if we haven't incorporated or haven't implemented a distributed architecture before, it's going to take some time and some effort and some money to get folks up to speed on how to do that well. All right, so some expectations: small batch sizes and small teams. We understand that we won't be having these massive teams working on this massive code base. We're going to tease out certain functionality and have a smaller team that's responsible for capturing the concept, working with subject matter experts, and delivering and fielding and maintaining those capabilities in the small. We're going to be using bounded context, Dr. Eric Evans with domain-driven design to somehow, again, bound the context, right? To put a smaller container around things versus kind of eating the world in one bite. We'll use API-based contracts for interactions, which means that as long as we adhere to those contracts, we can make a lot of changes, massive changes internally. And as long as we maintain that contract, nothing else has to change. So there are no ripple effects that are unforeseen and unexpected and unwanted. More functionality is delivered to market or internal users, end users sooner. This is based on numerous studies. This is certainly the case because if you have a small system that you're building, which might take 6 weeks with a small handful of services that you're building out, your chances of delivering the functionality faster, again, 6 weeks versus 6 months or a year, and delivering it more accurately are much higher with that regard. And that comes to the next point, which is building the right product. If you have a tight development loop and a tight feedback loop, then everything has a much higher fidelity. I do want to stop and ask if anybody has been working on a monolith at any point in their career, maybe you still are. It's not unheard of for a monolith to have a 12 to 18 month release cycle. So let's just say on the low end of that, if it's 12 months, has anybody worked with a subject matter expert who was there at the beginning, but wasn't there by the time you actually deployed the software? Of course, it happens. People accept a new position within the company, they leave, they change jobs, which means that the new person comes in and they may have entirely different ideas. So something that looked like you were right on target has missed the mark entirely. When you have a 6-week build cycle and you deliver the functionality in 6 weeks, what are the chances of retaining that same subject matter expert and hitting the mark? Very good, right? So we're going to be relying on that for our assessment. Improved quality, well, we have small modifications that we're making versus major overhauls. We have much higher end user satisfaction. Again, studies show that, largely because you're working with them closely, delivering more quickly, and you don't miss the mark as greatly as when there can be this 6 to 12 month or 12 to 18 month delivery timeframe. Small frequent releases, as I said, expose and help resolve process issues in the small. When the releases are tiny, well-planned and well-choreographed events, they can happen at will. So if something breaks, if there is a realization on the subject matter expert's part that, oh, I missed this part, I forgot to tell you that we have to be able to incorporate this, you may be able to roll out something that changes that incorporates that within a day or two. And that's unheard of when you have a 12 to 18 month release cycle. So when you can do things at will, when you can have new releases or fixes at will, it changes and improves the way you deliver software. Again, this is all for the purpose of this assessment. Your mileage may vary. So monoliths, this is what we're comparing to. We have a monolith in this example that we use. It's very robust, it's reliable, it's established, we use it, we like it. Well, maybe that's a bit far, but we know it, right? The monolith does it all. So it has a lot of capabilities wrapped into one thing. And I love this illustration that kind of sums it up pretty well, but monoliths doesn't necessarily, the idea of a monolith doesn't necessarily have anything to do with size either. Maybe it's a small monolith. You've probably heard of baby monoliths. They're smaller, they're maybe department level, but they do everything too. It has 15 different functions wrapped into one app. There's still a lot to unpack here, let's be real. And compromises, well, they will be made when it comes to a monolith, because everything has to scale together, everything has to, work together, which everything has to be deployed and tested together. So there are times that it just is far less convenient and slows the development deployment velocity down just by the case that it is incorporates a lot of different functionality in one thing, one unit. So I see that we're getting closer on time than I'd like, so I'm going to move through this pretty quickly. Some assumptions for the monolith is that we release once a year. And again, I think that's on the light side, but we'll use it as an example to keep the numbers round. About 10 months of development before the code freeze, and a month of integration testing and bug fixes, a month of user acceptance testing, which many times results in logging new requirements, which are typically, in many cases, the early requirements that we missed. But it is what it is. We're going to compare that to our distributed architectures initiative that we're wanting to consider. The average cadence of releases with a distributed system is 7,448 per day. At this point, people say, where did you get that? Well, back in 2011, Amazon actually documented this. They clearly stated they were releasing an updated or new microservice every 11.6 seconds. So do the math. That's 7,448 times a day. And that was 11 years ago, right? So if your company today in 2022 is only 1/1000th as effective as Amazon was 11 years ago, that's still 7.448 releases a day, which is over 2,500 releases a year. That's not too bad. Let's say for our initiative that we can release 14 new services in the first year, which means that if you can release 14 new services and you're releasing 2,500 releases a year, let's say seven times a day, that means each of your year one services can average a release every other day. So if there are changes, updates, fixes you need to release, you can do that every other day and still hit that low number of 7 times a day. So how much functionality can be delivered more quickly or more accurately? If you could approach zero with missed requirements and missed opportunities, missed expectations, how much would that be worth to your organization? A lot, right? If users can have needed functionality months or years sooner, what's that worth to your company? Again, we all agree, a lot, right? So quantifying. We have volatile functionality. Start there. Start with things that sales has been clamoring for, product development or engineering has been clamoring for, things that change dramatically, that is capabilities that a monolith is not as suited to implement, right? Because they change so often and we need to be able to change them often. Focus on producing those key abilities and define interfaces in the monolith to work with the new capabilities you're teasing out. The average time to get an interface API live with the monolith is 6 months, because if we have a 12-month release cycle for the monolith, we'll just have that. So on average, it'll be about 6 months, because some requests for an interface we'll get in the first half of the year, some in the last half. We average it to 6 months. Average business size, I'm going to say for this demo, it's $500 million annual revenue, just because that's the median size of a mid-sized business in the US. You have to have a number to go with. I just use that. Use what works for you. The impact of high demand projects implemented via distributed systems. I'm going to say for the purposes of this, again, we said that we could justify this project will make 14 million in new revenue. That breaks out if we say 14 new services in the first year, that it'll be $1 million benefit realized per service. And you don't typically break it out per service. I'm just doing it for convenience here for today's demo. There are costs, things like upskilling. Don't minimize those. Don't leave those out. There is a ramp up cost because it takes time to get up to speed. I am offsetting that by cost avoidance and avoidance of contextualization issues, plugging in new functionality to the massive monoliths and making sure there's nothing that the ripple effect is real. So I'm offsetting that, but again, you'd probably document both in case there is a discrepancy between the two. I'm omitting other things that may smooth or speed the path. Again, just for simplicity for the example. There will be new platform costs, because typically when you have some kind of a distributed system, you require some kind of a cloud platform. Maybe you'll go to a public cloud. Maybe you'll spin up some other capabilities within your private cloud, whatever. You're going to incur some additional costs versus the existing costs where you have your monolith fielded already. Now, we will assume that there would be the chance to implement some of this functionality in the monolith if we just stayed the original path. Let's say 5 million of the new capability that we'll realize 14 million from. We might not get it all in there, but we could get 5 million worth of benefit if we just continued to work on the monolith. So we can't take credit for that. It's just shifting it from one column to the other. We're saying we would get 5 million worth if we stayed with the monolith. We want the full amount, so we're offsetting. So if we expect new revenues of 14 million in the first year, here are our costs and opportunity costs. So the net gain or loss from adoption would be 6 million after year one. If we look at payback, 8 million in terms of our, let me go back here in terms of our project costs. And we have our annual cash inflow of 14 million. the payback period would only be 6.86 months, which would seem to indicate we should approve that, right? So let's go a bit farther with things and we'll see what the net present value is. So we'll go with our totals for year one. We have that. We look at totals for year two. We figure we can get better at this as we go. We double the number of services we can add in the second year. So we double the number of services. I'm just out of an abundance of caution saying that we'll probably have less impact in the next year per microservice. You know, we make more, but we don't have the linear growth in terms of impact that we might expect. So let's say we're only realizing a benefit of 750,000 per microservice versus the $1 million we were hoping and getting the first year. So we get 35 million in new revenue year two. We also assume a linear ability to expand the monolith, which is probably overly optimistic because, again, the more complex it gets, the slower you typically get in terms of capabilities you can add. But we'll assume a linear expansion. Again, optimistic in terms of the costs, or, you know, expansive and liberally considering the costs. So we have a net gain from year two of 21 million that we're projecting. Year three is largely the same, continued on out. We get a little better at this. We deliver new services in year three, a little faster production because we have more people, more upskill done, more of a framework to work with. I'm again declining or showing decline in the impact as we go, even though that's probably not the case. But I like to be pessimistic in terms of benefits realized in terms of our projections. Again, we assume we can expand the monolith linearly, which is probably not the case, but we'll assume. And of course, year three net gain loss from adoption would be $40 million gain in this example. If we apply that net present value formula to this, we see that we make 6 million, 21 million, and 40 million of realized gain each year. And we assume a 5% cost of capital over 3 periods. And we see that the benefit is 61 million and change per this example. So we approve it, right? So a few of the factors we visited, it's tough to quantify qualitative measures, but it's a start. You have to start somewhere. You consider how this initiative would affect all of these things, your organizations, your groups, your teams work, how your tech stack would be impacted, how it would contribute to recruitment and retention, how it would affect the business. And you document all of these things, pros and cons, pluses and minus, costs and increased revenue streams or costs avoided. In summary, a critical analysis yields a better understanding of impacts and inputs. It can provide more objective and compelling justification to you and to others for the initiative. You need to be honest. Please be honest with yourself and with others. Your credibility is at stake, and your chance of getting this initiative through and future initiatives depends on it. You need to document and communicate assumptions clearly and be open to course corrections. If you get it wrong, that's good. So you can fix it. It's good if you fix it up front, I guess I should say. So you get a better analysis and better outcome coming out as you proceed. In short, these folks are not your enemy. They are your allies. And if we make them our allies, if we realize they're our allies, good things happen for all of us. And with that, I guess I'm just out of time. So I will, I'll hang on for a couple minutes and grab any questions I can. If I miss your questions, please do reach out to me on email, or better yet, on Twitter. If you think of something later, tomorrow, doesn't matter. Ping me. I'd be happy to continue. So thanks so much. Go JCON.